Hello and welcome to the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity's online webinar. I'm Hawa Gindo, the Stakeholder Engagement and Communications Advisor. For those of you tuning in to our webinar for the first time, we're excited to have you. Whether you're a new or existing CCFI member, we're here to help you build trust in Canada's agri-food system. The Canadian Centre for Food Integrity is a national not-for-profit organization with a clearly defined mandate as a service provider to help Canada's food system earn trust by coordinating research, resources, dialogue, and training. We offer various membership packages with great benefits, including free members webinars, exclusive members-only research with access to data, tables, and demographic breakdowns, complimentary summit registrations, voting powers, and much more. We know that building trust takes time and effort, but we're confident that our members have the tools and resources they need to succeed. Become a CCFI member today and join us in the crucial work of building public trust. Today's complimentary webinar is facilitated by Darcy Doan and is titled 4 Canadian Consumer Trends and Their Impact on Businesses. Darcy is an agriculture economist by training with a background in survey research and over 20 years of experience, advising governments and industry stakeholders on policy issues facing the agri-food sector. Before we start, I want to remind everyone to please submit all questions in the Q&A window located at the bottom of your Zoom webinar. We will address them at the end of the presentation during the Q&A period. Kindly advise this presentation will be recorded and the recording will be made available following the webinar. I will now turn the session over to Darcy. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Hawa. I'm very pleased to be here with everyone today to present the results of this research and to have a bit of a discussion about it afterwards. I want to thank you all very much for joining me today, and I'd like to invite you to settle in. My discussion will be about half an hour, maybe a little bit more, and then we hope to have a few minutes for the Q&A at the end. So we have a fairly short time together, so I'm going to launch right in and start by sharing a presentation. There, I hope that that is visible to everyone now. There we go. And I'm able to change the slide. So there's the title. The title of the study, which is commissioned by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, are Industry Implications of Evolving Consumer Behavior. This work was undertaken by 3 partners, so by me, Darcy Doan Consulting, in partnership with the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute and the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, who is hosting this webinar today. Just briefly on the purpose and methodology, the purpose of the study was to inform and engage with stakeholders about the evolving expectations and behaviors of Canadian consumers, particularly as it relates to sustainable agriculture, but I will be talking about some other topics today as well. So you might ask, how did we identify consumer expectations and behaviors? First, we did a literature review focusing on the literature that looks at trends and, if possible, speculates about what the future of those trends might be in the future. And we also looked at surveys that are complementary to the CCFI survey data. So we did quite a bit of a deep dive into CCFI public trust survey data from 2018 to 2022. And a collaborator at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, Angèle Poirier, dove in and did some econometric analysis to identify trends in that CCFI survey data. Finally, I completed a series of one-on-one discussions with about a dozen industry experts from retail, food manufacturing, marketing, innovation, and agri-food investing spaces And I put a picture of a crystal ball up on this slide because I asked these experts mainly to make predictions about what they expected in terms of current trends, in terms of how they might change or persist into the future. And no one, of course, can predict the future. So what I'm going to be discussing today, insofar as it focuses on our expectations for the future, is really a best guess by industry experts. So before I launch right into it, just a few words about the overall context in which Canadian consumers are making decisions about food. Some of this will be quite obvious to many of you on the line, and so I'll ask for your patience while I run through it. But the first point is that the Canadian consumer market for food is a very large, diverse market. Essentially, it's almost everyone in Canada participates in the market for food products, at least occasionally. So while I'll be talking about trends today, of course, there will be groups of Canadians that buck the trend in every instance. The importance of taste, everyone wants their food to taste good, and our purchases of food are certainly importantly determined by by our preferred tastes, textures, and flavors. That will not be the focus of what I'm talking about today, although I acknowledge that they are very important determinants of food choices. Third thing to keep in mind is that unlike some other purchases, for example, the purchase of a vehicle, Canadians buy food regularly, routinely, and these choices are made under time pressure. So while we might wish that Canadians spent more time or more effort on their food product choices, the reality is that when they are in the grocery store or even shopping for food online, they may face hundreds of individual food product decisions in a relatively short period of time. And these, again, are routine decisions. Finally, consumer decisions about food may be subject to misinformation or confusing sets of information. What I'm presenting here today is a representation of what consumers believe or think about the food system. You may say, oh, I don't think there's any evidence to underpin that belief, but the point of my presentation is not to evaluate the evidence that underlies consumer perceptions. So with that, let me talk a bit about how we determined what a trend is in the context of this study. First of all, the trend should be primarily consumer-driven, as opposed to, say, producer or industry-driven or technology-driven, although it sometimes is difficult to tease that out exactly. A trend should influence multiple consumer behaviors, but not be so broad as to encompass everything. In the view of the experts that I interviewed, the trend should be likely to endure roughly over the next decade. And again, in the opinion of experts, the trend should be highly influential over consumer purchasing behavior either now or expected in the future. So before I launch into individual trend discussions where we're focused on issues of concern to consumers, I wanted to let you know about this first finding that we had through econometric analysis, which showed that, in fact, when we talk about concerned consumers, there's a clustering of concern. We found a group that represents roughly 13% of the Canadian population that is interested in this cluster of five food-related issues. They're interested in food waste, the health impacts of food, environmental impacts of food, the affordability of food, and animal welfare. This group is more likely to be women than men. 65% of the concerned consumers are women, slightly more likely to be seniors than non-seniors. And they're also more likely to have limited formal education and to be in a lower income category than the average Canadian consumer. So this is relevant because when I talk about consumers who are particularly concerned about one issue, you can keep in mind that they're also likely to be concerned about a variety of other issues. And these consumers as well are likely to be making linkages between food-related issues. So the first trend I want to talk about today is around consumer concern for environmental sustainability. So where does this concern come from? I think we can say that among the Canadian population, surveys are showing that anxiety is growing about environmental sustainability, particularly when it comes to climate change. There's a picture here of forest fires, and as we all know, we've recently come through a summer that was quite challenging in terms of smoke and wildfire impacts across the country. There is an increasing feeling among many Canadians that climate change might have a personal or an impact on their own quality of life. In a 2023 survey by Ipsos called their Global Trends Report, they found that 3/4 of Canadians agreed with this statement: "We are heading for environmental disaster unless we change our habits quickly." Furthermore, climate change is viewed as a threat, specifically to the food system. In the 2022 Public Trust survey by CCFI, they found that almost half of Canadians view climate change as the greatest threat to Canada's food system. Furthermore, sustainably grown food, if we look at the broader term of sustainability and what does that mean to Canadians, there's certainly evidence, again, through CCFI surveys that Canadian consumers associate the broader term sustainability specifically with environmental sustainability. So when asked to define what it means for food to be sustainably grown, the most popular answer by far in both 2020 and more recently in 2023 was that the food has a positive impact on climate change and the environment. However, when it comes to environmental sustainability, consumers are unsure how to translate their concern into action. And I put this quote up, which comes from one of my expert interviews, because I think it really encapsulates the challenge as expressed by a number of experts, but also as seen in survey data. So Canadians are interested in the environmental sustainability of the food they consume. They feel like it's an important topic. They also have a sense that perhaps their choices are important when it comes to environmental sustainability, but they don't really know how to translate that into action. There are also, of course, price constraints when it comes to potentially choosing environmentally sustainable food. So just expanding on that a bit more, consumers who are concerned about environmental sustainability are quite likely to say that they look for information about the environmental sustainability of the food, about the environmental sustainability of food. But what they find in terms of the informational environment can be confusing. There are a multiplicity of logos and label claims on the Canadian market that pertain to agricultural production. Some of those may be interpreted by consumers as speaking directly to the environmental impacts of agricultural production, but it is somewhat the number of consumers who say that they look for assurance logos, first of all, is fairly low. In the 2022 Public Trust Survey by CCFI, only 1/4 of Canadians report seeking assurance logos when they shop. Among those who do seek logos, non-GMO in Canada or organic were the most commonly sought. There is a lack of consistent, relevant, and harmonized metrics on the Canadian market when it comes to arguably those factors that are most important to consumers, such as, for example, GHG emissions or direct impacts as it pertains to climate change. Furthermore, there's some issues around trust. CCFI's, again, 2022 survey found that only 12% of Canadians say that sustainable food labels are very believable. Most find them only somewhat believable. And 41% of Canadians reported being very concerned about greenwashing or misleading information about how a company's products are environmentally sound. Other surveys have found similar levels of concern among Canadian consumers about greenwashing or misleading information. This translates into a limited willingness to pay a premium for environmentally sustainable food. That's not to say that some are not willing, or at least state that they're willing, and some, of course, do purchase food that bear environmental labels. But this is typically quite a small minority of the Canadian population. So what does this mean? Does this mean consumers are doing nothing when it comes to the environmental sustainability of the food that they buy? And I would say, no, it doesn't necessarily mean that. There are a couple of shorthand consumer strategies that Canadians are using to choose environmentally sustainable food. Surveys are showing that Canadians have a very high and strong association between sustainability and locally produced food. It's almost a definitional issue in some, in the sense that when asked to define what it means for food to be sustainably grown, roughly 3 out of 10 Canadians will say it means that the food was locally grown. So Canadians are choosing to buy locally grown food. Again, this is usually easily discernible in the grocery store because origin is commonly shown on packaging or on signage in stores. Consumers are also choosing to reduce food and packaging waste. Now, this is a particular, we'll talk about this a bit more when we talk about affordability. So this is a strategy to increase affordability, but there's also evidence that consumers are choosing to reduce food and packaging waste for environmental reasons. This again is something that is the impact of these actions are easily discernible. And there is survey evidence that shows that Canadians believe that they themselves, through their household food waste, can have a significant impact on overall food waste. So what are the implications of this for industry in terms of Canadian consumers wanting to do something about environmentally sustainability, but not really knowing what to do? Communication obviously is key, and it's a very big challenge in this area. We're dealing with, quite a high degree of skepticism, maybe a lack of trust, as well as a very complex and confusing, potentially confusing topic area. How do you communicate about very complicated environmental production systems in a way that Canadian consumers will understand? So just a few ideas here. Important to choose credible spokespeople. There's some evidence that Canadians view farmers and scientists as quite credible on environmental sustainability messaging. And then to consider the development of simple metrics that are harmonized industry-wide. I know there is quite a bit of effort going on in this space in Canadian industry, and there's some suggestion that this could have an impact if and when these labels become available on the marketplace. And then a huge asset currently is that Canadians do associate locally produced food with environmentally sound food, and so there's an opportunity to build on this existing preference or this existing association. And then finally, just important to act, even if it's not clear what messages might resonate most with Canadians. Important to show that this matters to you as a Canadian agri-food business, because it does represent a risk to some perceived laggards or those who are silent on the issue, may be perceived as not caring or it not being a priority to you. So moving on now to discuss health and wellness, which is, of course, a long-standing trend in the Canadian consumer marketplace. But what changes about health and wellness really are the specifics, both as science around nutrition changes, but also as certain ideas gain popularity in the media and other places. About 2/3 of Canadians say that they have a growing interest or high level of interest in how food impacts their health. And Canadian consumers are also more likely to search out information about health, the health impacts of food, than they are about any other food-related topic. So first, let's start by talking about some common strategies that are used by Canadians when deciding what is a healthy food, how to choose healthy foods. There is a widespread association between especially fresh fruit and vegetables and a healthy diet. Many Canadians say that they're trying to increase their consumption of fresh fruit and vegetables, but that cost is a factor. In fact, it's the main factor why they are not able to eat as much fresh fruit and vegetables as they might want to. Protein is another area where Canadians are trying to up their consumption. And there's quite a bit of evidence that shows when they are looking to increase their consumption of protein, many Canadians are looking to increase their consumption of plant-based protein or to shift some of their protein consumption from animal-based to plant-based protein. This is, again, cost is a factor in increasing the consumption of protein. When we talk about affordability, we'll talk a little bit more about meat consumption declining recently. So cost is a factor for both of these categories. But I also want to point out that this doesn't mean, when it comes to protein, it doesn't mean that Canadians are necessarily becoming vegetarians. Most Canadians eat both, or indicate that they eat both plant-based and animal-based proteins. Only 2% of Canadians said that they never eat meat in a recent survey by CCFI. But moving away from those broad trends, there's an increasing sense among Canadians that what might be good for their health, what might be a good diet for them, is not necessarily the same as what might be a good diet for other people. People are looking for dietary advice and nutritional information that is customized to their own age, their gender, and any specific health concerns that they might have. And there is a wide variety of information available that can be customized to your specific needs on the internet. If you voluntarily provide information, there's also increasingly devices that can be used to monitor the impact of your food choices on your own personal physiology, including devices that will measure compounds in your urine. And you can wear a continuous glucose monitor that will also provide you with real-time information about how your food choices impact certain biological characteristics. So the information technology is definitely helping to drive this trend. And here I'm going to say that Joanne MacArthur at Nourish Food Marketing has done quite a lot of interesting work in this area if you're interested in reading more about it. Finally, another trend is certainly around holistic wellness. So the sense that what's good for me what's good for the environment is also good for me. So my personal health is influenced by the environment in which I live. In addition, my physical and mental health influence each other, and nutrition has an impact on both physical and mental health as well. The main example here that comes to mind is the association between good gut health, not only with physical health outcomes, but also impacts in terms of anxiety and depression. So what are the implications for industry of these? Well, clearly, there are some very sizable niche markets out there. So when we talk, for example, about women eating for women's health, that's roughly half the population. That's a pretty sizable niche. So to the extent that health claims can be developed and backed by evidence, that there's certainly, it seems that those will be could be compelling in the future. And there's a need, of course, to stay on top of trends because these change quite rapidly over time. Finally, there's a conundrum when it comes to protein. There's definite headwinds for animal agriculture and a need to communicate with Canadians about the place of animal products, dairy and meat in a healthy diet. On the other hand, there's certainly opportunities for plant-derived proteins, and Canada is a very big producer of some high protein plant products such as pulses, and there are clear opportunities there for Canadian producers. The next trend I wanted to talk about is affordability and availability. The value for money has always been important to Canadian consumers, but there have been a series of shocks recently, starting with the pandemic and moving through to the war in the Ukraine and general inflation today, that have focused the consumer's mind both on affordability and availability. And I'll talk more about affordability, certainly, but just staying on availability for a moment. The pandemic, I think, may have been the first time that Canadian consumers were confronted with empty shelves in the grocery store, where it wasn't possible temporarily to purchase such basics as flour, for example, and it does focus the mind. There is some evidence that concerns around affordability and availability remain high on the minds of consumers long after the initial shock has abated. Some experts as well expect concerns around affordability to persist because expectations around some underlying factors such as weather events, global insecurity, and risks to trade that are expected, as well as rising costs and for inputs that are expected by some experts to persist or perhaps even worsen over the next decade or so. So there's just a few headlines. These are from 2022. As everyone knows, food inflation has certainly been a hot button topic in the media and among politicians. I could have used much more recent headlines, but it's been in the media consistently over the last couple of years. So what are consumers doing beyond, I would say, in some cases, looking for someone to blame for high food prices? They're also developing strategies to keep their own costs under control. So they're trading down in a variety of ways. The experts I spoke to identified that Canadians are eating at home or fast food outlets rather than in restaurants to the same extent that they used to be. They're shopping at discount stores, including Dollaramas and other dollar stores, with greater frequency and spending more money there than they used to. A larger proportion of the total grocery basket is typically on sale now. They're buying a larger proportion of items on deal than they used to. They're buying when they have the financial means to do so. They're buying in bulk when they can, when items are on sale or when they see a good price, they buy a lot of it. They're also replacing fresh produce and to some extent meats with shelf stable or frozen product. Again, easier to take advantage of deals and store product when it's not fresh. So, what are the implications for industry of these trends around affordability and availability? First, maintaining trust. I'll start with the second point on the slide. Maintaining trust is key. So, efforts to increase transparency around pricing and certainly to avoid any appearance of greed will be key to maintaining trust when consumers are worried about food prices. And then just in terms of the sustainable or the availability and the sustainable availability of food, many of these strategies, of course, have long been in use in the agri-food industry, but more use of contracting, diversifying sources, ensuring that supply chains are resilient to shocks. Some experts I spoke to felt that Canadian consumers may also be increasingly looking for ways to lock in supply or prices, which could be done, through the emergence, for example, of food subscriptions, where you could lock in supply and prices over even a limited period of time, should prices and supply remain volatile going forward. So the last trend I want to talk about this morning is a little bit different than the other ones in the sense that it's an emerging trend and not necessarily yet having a big impact on Canadian consumer markets, but is expected by many experts to have more of an impact in the future. So this is the trend towards caring about the social sustainability of the food that you buy. And so what's underlying this and why do some feel that this is a growing trend? Well, the pandemic brought to the fore the essential nature of the work done by people in the agri-food industry, as well as, of course, healthcare workers and others whose work may not have been fully appreciated prior to the pandemic. But the work of grocery store cashiers, farm laborers, meat cutters, and others was really noticed and appreciated in a new way. And there's other social forces as well, such as the Black Lives Matter movement and the push towards reconciliation with Canada's Indigenous people that's expected to continue to shape society's expectations for business practices in Canada and among the companies that Canadians do business with. So as well, this would encompass a concern about animal welfare, which is a more longstanding concern among a proportion of the Canadian population who's concerned about the welfare of the animals used in agricultural systems. So, as I said, at the present time, this trend is not necessarily having a huge influence over behavioral choices, but some experts that I spoke to, and there's also some survey evidence that would back up the idea that these social sustainability issues are relatively more important to young Canadians, which may indicate that they have some staying power and could become more important in the future. So on the Canadian market at the present time, however, there are not a lot of claims that are made about social sustainability. There is the Fair Trade logo, which enjoys a fairly high degree of recognition in Canada, but is only applied to certain imported food products. Cocoa, sugar, coffee isn't widely available and not typically applied to Canadian produced products. There are certainly some claims around animal welfare, such as free range, that are well known to the Canadian consumers who look for those claims and have been on the market for some time. And then finally, I noticed as I was doing research for this paper that there's quite a few claims being made by companies, more so on their websites than on the logo, but about the treatment of workers in their businesses. I would suggest that these claims right now are being made largely for employee attraction and retention purposes in a tight labor market, and given the labor challenges facing the Canadian agri-food industry. But there's, I think, some evidence that consumers are also looking for information about the treatment of workers in Canadian agri-food businesses. So what are the implications of this for industry? I think, first of all, there's an opportunity to proactively build transparency and trust around some social sustainability factors through enhancing measurement and reporting. It may first be necessary to do some research to determine which aspects of social sustainability are most important to your customers, but then to do some measurement and reporting around those aspects, and possibly some opportunities as well to develop industry standards and harmonized logo or label claims similar to the work that's going on now in environmental sustainability claims. And of course, as in all cases, to keep these messages as clear and simple as possible. Finally, there's a need for vigilance around these issues because perceived worker or animal mistreatment is clearly a reputational risk. Stories of this nature move very rapidly through social media channels and can be both a business and a long-term reputational risk for businesses. So finally, bringing it all together, I mean, Canadian consumers have clearly very high expectations from the food system. They want healthy, affordable food that is at the same time sustainably produced, especially in terms of environmental impact, but increasingly perhaps in terms of social outcomes as well. There's some trade-offs, as most know, in terms of spending more in one area. Those costs, passing them on to consumers, could reduce affordability. So, some tensions given consumers high expectations. And there are some really important existing advantages, though, for Canadian producers to build on in the Canadian marketplace. Canadians have positive associations with Canadian food, with food produced locally and in Canada. They also indicate relatively high levels of trust in Canadian farmers. These are advantages that can certainly be built on when communicating with consumers about complicated issues such as environmental sustainability and the environmental impacts of agricultural production. This will remain a major challenge because although it is simply challenging to devise messages that are both credible and not overly complicated. Final point is that while this presentation has focused exclusively on consumers, as we all know, investors are also forces for change. And so some of the changes or demands that Canadian consumers are expected to be increasingly looking for are also things that investors are increasingly looking for through ESG requirements, and that governments are also driving change through policy. So I think I have been speaking already for quite a long time, and that brings me to the end of my presentation. It looks like we might have at least a couple of questions in the Q&A channel. So I'm going to pause and turn it back over to Hawa. Finally, I just really want to thank everyone again for joining today.
Thank you, Darcy. Great presentation. So we have one question in the Q&A. I'd like to encourage everyone to please submit questions in the Q&A chat. So the first one is, with all these trends and what looks to be competing forces, where is the cost of Canadian food basket trending towards?
Canadian food prices are certainly trending upwards. And they're trending upwards at a fairly rapid pace. I'm afraid that I don't have statistics in front of me now that I can confidently quote, but I would refer anyone to the Statistics Canada website and their monthly reporting on food price inflation, and as it compares as well to general inflation in the Canadian economy. But food price inflation has been outstripping general inflation generally over the last couple of years. Another source for great data on looking at food price inflation is the Agri-Food Analytics Lab out of Dalhousie. And will the presentation be shared afterward? I see that second question. I'm going to pass that over to you, Hawa.
Thank you. Yes, so a copy of the presentation will be shared along with the recording. We have a few more questions coming in. The first one is, if a company was to prioritize their budget to earn trust based on these trends, what should they do?
Thank you very much. So Crystal, you have put your name on that question. So thank you, Crystal Mackay, for that great question. I think that there are a few key priorities for communication. So I would say that communication, again, around environmental sustainability is a priority that merits some budgetary expenditure. And I would also suggest that messages around affordability are key right now. And there may be opportunities to indicate how companies are balancing those two, but probably best not to talk about one to the exclusion of the other. We didn't really talk a great deal, about, or I didn't speak a great deal about food waste and waste in this presentation, but I will say that there is increasing Canadian consumer interest in reducing food waste. First and foremost in their homes, but there's also a recognition that food waste occurs throughout the supply chain. And food waste is one of those nice, or I would say nice, but it's an area where, in theory at least, reductions in waste could also result in efficiencies, which could in turn improve price or cost elements. So I think there's some real opportunity to put emphasis on messaging around action on waste that I think, at least in the short term, is likely to resonate with consumers. But then I'll just also say that looking more long term, measurement and verification and harmonization of measurement is a costly and long-term endeavor that I know many Canadian stakeholders are already investing resources in.
Thank you, Darcy. Next question. Retailer brands in Canada have significantly taken a hit, while some like Costco and Dollarama increased. What can they do to regain trust?
Right. So I think that is true. Although I say that I have seen statistics that show growth, particularly in Dollarama, but I have not seen evidence that sales in major national brands have declined. That's the first thing I should say. It may be happening, but I haven't seen evidence of that. And the other thing I want to say is it's not that Canadian consumers are going to dollar stores and Costco and Walmart because they see that they can save money on products. It's not necessarily that they don't trust the stores that they formerly or that they used to shop more at. They're just seeing that they can get the same products for less money sometimes somewhere else. So it's a very practical strategy that they're using. When it does come to trust, I think we've seen that the retailers, I think, properly putting emphasis on transparency and trying to communicate that the costs are rising throughout the supply chain and that the cost increases are therefore inevitable at retail, and that there's a limit to the extent to which prices can be frozen. There were some price freezing efforts made, certainly, I think, right around this time last year. But when all your costs are increasing, that's not very sustainable for a retailer. So I think doing what they can to communicate with consumers about the underlying forces that are driving prices up. But also, I think, as many retailers are doing, offering to honor prices that are being offered at other retailers.
Thanks, Darcy. We have another question regarding environmental sustainability. Consumer focus is often on the farming sector rather than along the full chain, with maybe the exception of packaging and food waste. Do you see this continuing, or could there be a shift in focus on processors, retailers, and/or brands?
Thank you for that question, Susie. I am going to make reference on that because I think it's a really good question. When consumers think about environmental sustainability, really, are they really only thinking about what occurs on the farm, or are they looking at the entire food chain? Because obviously the entire food chain does matter for environmental impact. And I'm going to make reference now to CCFI's 2023 research because they asked Canadian consumers, particularly, to ask what they think is having. I think the question is where they think, how effective are certain actions, and some of those actions were at the farm, some of those actions were at the food processing level, and some of those actions were at the food retail level. And I think that the Canadian consumers felt that actions at all three levels could be effective. So I would say in particular, there seemed to be a common focus on actions that were perceived to be reducing waste. So actions that were perceived to be reducing, say, water waste at the farm were viewed as very positive, were viewed as very effective. Actions that reduced waste in food processing, similarly reducing waste at retail, actions such as donating surplus food to food banks, or improved inventory management to reduce waste, all resonating with consumers, I would suggest, because it's fairly easy to understand. So I do think that consumers will find messages about the entire supply chain to resonate. Yeah, but there may indeed be a focus at the farm level. But again, I'd suggest that I think that there's a possibility that consumers would be looking at the entire, or would be open to messages about the entire food chain, recognizing that not all impacts occur on the farm. Although when you think about certain issues that are important to some consumers, such as chemical residues or pesticide residues, then obviously that's a more farm level impact.
Thank you, Darcy. We have another question. Wondering if you heard from industry experts about how to deal with misinformation regarding sustainability. There seems to be a lot of misinformation, assumptions, especially in the agriculture industry.
I didn't hear so much about experts about how to address the challenges around greenwashing or misinformation. Well, actually, that's not true. I had a couple of experts say to me that they found that they were moving away from making statements on labels, for example, because there simply wasn't enough space to tell a complicated story, and they were moving more towards a strategy that relied on their web presence, because on the web presence they can provide more detail, they can explain certain things, and in a way that's just not possible to do on the label. Of course, the obvious challenge around that is that not everyone will visit your website. And so your reach might be more limited there. But there was I think a widespread recognition that this is a very large challenge, and that there are no perhaps really easy answers for how to ensure that whatever you say about environmental sustainability is credible to your audience, because to be in fact impactful, obviously it needs to be credible.
Thank you, Darcy. Next question is, thanks for your comments on food waste. Do you have any sense of the type of information that consumers are looking for from companies to help them reduce household food waste?
Oh, yeah, that's that's a good question. I'm afraid I don't really know what kind of information consumers might need, but I will say they're looking for information. So the surveys over the last few years have shown that many consumers are looking for information both on how to save money on food, but they're also looking for information on how to reduce food waste in the home. So I think that's really all I can usefully say on that topic, to say that there's interest out there and Canadian consumers are looking. They're likely to appreciate practical tips and tricks from industry, but I don't think I can tell you exactly what kinds of tips and tricks they're looking for.
Thanks, Darcy. Next we have, should industry associations be more responsible for messaging versus the producers and retailers if we are harmonized in building trust?
Interesting question. Well, I think that depending again on the level at which the claim pertains, like, is this a claim that pertains mostly to agricultural production, or is this a claim or an issue that's going to encompass the entire, the entire value chain, including manufacturing, for example? There could be a need for collaboration throughout the value chain to develop, for example, if one were to envision some kind of label that would be affixed on a food product at retail that spoke to the GHG emissions associated with production of that product, and included all the GHG emissions associated with production of that product, you would need to include quite a bit more than just producers in the development of all the information that would be needed to produce that kind of label. So I guess I can't really say if it should be industry associations, but I would say that there's a need for collaboration throughout the supply chain.
Thank you. Next question up. Are there differences in consumer trends from rural areas to urban areas?
Okay, also a great question. It is not something that I looked at all in the study. Most Canadians are urban Canadians. So that's one thing I would say, that when you're talking about just in general, the subset that would be considered rural is, and I don't have the statistics at my fingers right now, but it's relatively much smaller. So yeah, I didn't look at those breakouts, but there could be differences between rural and urban Canadians. I guess one of the things people often associate with rural Canadians is that they understand agriculture better. I would say that that is maybe an assumption that might bear looking at as well, because I think even Canadians who live in smaller towns or across Canada are not necessarily connected to the agriculture industry. But yeah, it's not something I looked at.
Thank you, Darcy. We have 2 more questions. Where do you see eggs sitting in terms of animal proteins versus plant-based proteins when it comes to consumer behavior and perception?
Again, not something that was looked at specifically in the studies that I included as part of the research. So I can't really answer that question except to say that I think it's likely that eggs would be viewed as an animal-based protein and would be classed in the main with meat and dairy. But it could be interesting to look specifically at eggs and to see if people's perceptions around eggs are different from their perceptions about meat. But yeah, didn't do that.
Thank you. And lastly, we have, what are experts' perspectives on economic sustainability of food products?
So talked to, that's also a question that wasn't really addressed in the research, because it was focused on what do consumers think, and consumers are clearly really concerned about the affordability of their own food basket. And so the discussions that I had with experts were really focused on consumer mindset. How is this impacting their behavior and what they think? I can say that, as I mentioned a bit earlier, that there were a number of experts that I spoke to who do expect that affordability could remain a concern, could remain an issue in Canada or broadly more globally over the next decade. And that is because they see some of the underlying factors such as climate change, continued global instability, and trade disruptions as being persistent over the next number of years. And so they see affordability and prices rising as a medium-term trend. So maybe that's a partial answer to that question.
Thank you, Darcy. That about wraps up our Q&A period for today. Do you have a few words to say, or?
No, I really just want to thank everyone for taking the time to listen to this presentation. I hope that there were at least 1 or 2 insights in there that you can take away.
Thank you very much to our presenter, Darcy Doan, for her great presentation today. We trust that you enjoyed the online webinar and would be grateful if you could please complete our brief evaluation survey that you would receive by email, as your feedback is important to us. Until then, goodbye and have a great day.